All right, runners, I am super excited. I have Miss Elisabeth Scott on the podcast today. And all of you, I'm sure, probably are familiar with Elisabeth already from her amazing Instagram channel, Running Explained. And if you're not following her yet, you definitely need to. We'll give you all that information at the end of the episode if you want to connect with Elisabeth. But right now, I'm just so excited to start this conversation. So welcome, Elisabeth, to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So before we kind of jump into our topic of the day, tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and how you got into running.
Yes, my name's Elisabeth Scott. I am the founder of Running Explained. My goal in life is to get you, the runner, to feel good about your running, feel confident in your running. And if we get a little bit faster along the way, that's a bonus. So I'm a running coach. I call myself a running educator more than anything else. I'm obviously a runner myself. I started running in my late 20s after I quit drinking and needed to, I say this for, I started running because I wanted to lose weight. That's why I started running. And I know it's how a lot of other people find running as well, but it quickly became something that is completely different in my life. And I fell in love with the sport. And there is one of the things I love about running is that you can make it as simple or as complicated as you want to be. There is a ton to learn, but there's also a lot of running that's just you just got to go out and run. So I don't know. I try to find both the complexity and simplicity in the sport and communicate to runners wherever they might be on their journey about how to become better at what they're doing.
Yeah. So how did you kind of go from being a runner, getting into running, into becoming a running coach?
That's a good question. I fell backwards into coaching. When I started running, and I made every mistake you could make. I increased my volume way too rapidly. I ran a marathon 6 months after I started running. I got shin splints. I got IT band syndrome. I was running everything in a moderate or hard intensity. Despite all of those things, I actually found, a reasonable amount of success relatively early on. I ran some nice times and was like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. I'm doing these things that I never even thought possible only 6 months ago, especially for me, being a recovering alcoholic, a year ago I was dying and now I'm running marathons. But one of the things that really intrigued me about the sport is that when I started kind of scratching the surface, and I've always been a very, very curious person. I like to know the why. I like to understand the human body and the human psyche. Started scratching the surface and thinking, oh, there's reasons for all of these things, and they're all interconnected. There's a reason that this is happening. There's a reason why this is done the way it is. And kind of uncovering, I felt like I discovered Narnia. It was like, oh my God, there's this whole world that I never knew existed. And so when I started learning about the sport in that way, for me, it was very selfish. This is knowledge for me, right? I wanted to become a better runner. And then when I started learning more about the sport from a more technical perspective, and I was kind of looking around and seeing what, runners like us, recreational runners, were doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking, gee, a lot of people are making all the same mistakes that I did. And it seems like nobody's talking about it, or at least not loudly and simply the way that I felt that it could be communicated. So
Yeah.
I started the Instagram account just basically with the sole purpose of getting people to slow down on their easy runs.
Mm-hmm.
And then it kind of spiraled from there. And actually, I didn't intend to become somebody who coached. I really just wanted to share my knowledge and help prevent people from making mistakes like I did.
Yeah.
And yada, yada, yada. Here we are today.
Well, I think that, that's a story that you hear very commonly too. Is I didn't start out with that intention, and that's just kind of what happened along the way. So what did you used to do before you kind of got into Instagram and this world of running?
Yeah. So professionally, I was in boutique property management. So private. I used to manage luxury apartment buildings. And
Okay.
then after that, I worked for a company that helps people manage their private residences. And then I had a foray into my educational background is actually in psychology. So I actually worked I've done a lot of things in my career, but I also worked for a mental health nonprofit for a while. So I worked for small businesses for most of my life. So I have this background of kind of doing, being a small business person. I know how to do bookkeeping. I know how to do social media marketing. I know how to I know how to do customer service. I know how to do all these things. And also I had this, kind of background and interest in humans, humanity, the human body, like I said, the human mind. So it people are like, oh my God, how did you be able to do it? How did you figure this out? I'm like, I got lucky. Like I had a lot of work experience that led me to be able to create a business that is, I knew how to do all these things ahead of time. So when I started my business, it was like, yeah, I know how to form an LLC. Like, yeah, I know how to, create social media templates. Yeah, I know how to do email marketing. So it's
Yeah.
a little bit different doing literally everything by yourself, but that's kind of where I came from.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense, which is very cool. And I love that you have a background in psychology because I feel like that lends so much to our interests because I hear so much of myself and you too. I also have an undergrad degree in psychology and I was pre-med and psychology in undergrad. And it
Did you
just
also do the thing where you're like, I want to become a psychiatrist? Just kidding. I don't want to go to med school.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
I didn't want to become a psychiatrist. My original goal was I wanted to be an orthopedic surgeon, but I just wanted to have a double major in psychology because human behavior fascinated me. And I wanted to learn more about how to be a better person and why we do what we do. And I feel like that has served me so well in my calling as a coach and what I do working with runners. And I'm sure you found the same thing. And I think that that's one thing, like this natural tendency toward curiosity and toward trying to understand why we do what we do as humans plays such a huge role in our success as runners.
Yes. And actually, it's interesting. Right before I kind of veered into the career that I have today as a
Mhm.
running, fitness professional, I was kind of on this weird inflection point in my career where we'd recently moved. My husband and I had moved, and I was like, I don't like, I want to do something different. And I don't know what that is. So I started looking at PhD programs in clinical psychology. And it kind of, it was like the back of my mind, I was like, oh, I should start reaching out for recommendations and I should, take the, GREs and all that.
Yeah.
And then as that was kind of ruminating in the back of my mind, I started this. And then also COVID hit, right? So it was kind of like this whole like, but I could, easily have seen myself going down the path of being a, clinician, a psychologist, but I'm not a therapist. I'm not a psychologist, right? That's not my
Yeah.
credential. But it is interesting to look at this through, because, and you see this too, obviously working with runners, there is so much that we do that I think a lot of runners say things like, oh, I just didn't have the willpower, or I just wasn't tough enough to push through, or, I'm so lazy. And it's like, well, let's back that up, because although the end result may have been you bailed on the rep or you skipped your run or whatever the thing is, I'm like, the complexity of how we make the decisions that we make is far more than just I suck, right?
Right.
And kind of helping people understand there's so much more to their behavior and the decisions and the choices that we make
Mhm.
than just these black or white, like I'm good or I'm bad, I
Yeah.
suck or I'm awesome kind of things.
Oh, yeah. And like, it's all about the thoughts that we think, right? The thoughts that we tell ourselves and the beliefs that we have. And I find that so much of that is subconscious because it's these beliefs and ideas that we've been forming about ourselves since we were young in a lot of ways. And they weren't running related, right? When we were 5 years old or 6 years old, but we've learned these themes that we then take and apply to every area of our life. And we do it without even realizing it. And it was funny because you talk about clinical psychology. Like, I loved the field of psychology, but I never wanted to be a psychologist because I could not imagine myself just like in a room, like the classic, on the couch, like just talking to people all day long. And I loved, which is funny now that I'm a podcast host, right? I mean, like it's literally, I love talking to people now, but like physical therapy was kind of a natural draw for me because it was, how can I motivate people to do what I know that they need to do in order for them to get better? So it had that aspect of human psychology in it, but there was also a lot of like the physical and the technical aspect as well. So you have done a lot of interviews and research around running. Your Instagram page is absolutely fantastic with the amount of information that you give out on a weekly basis for free, to anybody that wants to learn, which is awesome. So in like so much of your research and the interviews that you've done with experts across the running world, what would you say are some common themes that you've seen? And specifically, like, I want to kind of talk to maybe newer runners first. Like, what are two pieces of advice that you would give to someone that's like just starting out on their running journey?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that's such a great question. There's so many pieces of advice.
I know.
I will say, and I did this too. I did this when I was a new runner. And you don't have to get fancy before you master the basics. And
Mm,
what do I mean by that? There are a lot of people, we come into the sport, we try something new and we get hooked and we start looking at, I'm going to call the graduate level stuff, right? So let's say you're a new runner, you've been running casually for maybe a couple months or even a couple years, right? You've never really ventured beyond the 5K distance. You run a couple miles a couple times a week, but now you're starting to get into this whole thing of what we call proper training. Maybe you're training appropriately for your first real race or your first longer distance race, like a 10K or a half marathon. And you're thinking, oh, there's all this stuff about running and I didn't know. But what do you need to focus on? The basics. Are you running enough? Are you running at the right frequency, number of times per week? Are you running in the right training load distribution? Do you have a long run in your week? Do you have strides in your training? Do you know how to find what your easy effort zone is and do most of your training there? If we're including workouts, they're probably baby workouts because you're new, right? But what a lot of runners do is they think, well, I want to run these fast, fancy times and these fast, fancy distances. So they look at training that's more appropriate for somebody who's been running at a higher level for years or decades. And they look at that and they say, well, I saw on Instagram that this Olympic trials qualified marathoner is doing this workout. I'm like, back all the way up, right? You are not ever anywhere close to their. Are the general principles of how we train the same? Yes, but we are mastering the basics and the foundations. That Olympic trials qualifier marathoner is also still including the basics. They're just also now capable of putting in some fancier stuff. So that's why I see you're looking way too far ahead at the fancy stuff when you haven't even mastered the basics yet. I'd say that's kind of my number one thing. And the other thing I think is that for a lot of runners who are new, I tend to see them set their big goals too short and their small goals can be too long, right? So they say like, well, I want to, let's say again, new runner. And let's say I'm going to pull a number out of my hat. I want to run a sub 2 hour half marathon, but you've already run a 2:01 half marathon on an easy run in training. Oh my gosh, like you're going to probably smash that goal out of the water, right? So it's a great goal to have short term, but long term, you can probably think a little bit bigger, right? But then we have some of these goals that we think are going to be short term goals that actually end up being much longer term goals than we realize, right? Like I want to, I don't coach aesthetics, I don't coach weight loss, but some people are like, I want to do body recomposition. I want to get a lot stronger. I want to do a 200-pound deadlift, right? Pulling a number out of the air. Well, if you're currently deadlifting 60 pounds, that's probably going to take much longer than you realize. So kind of a thing about goal setting and like what to focus on when you're newer.
Oh, I love both of those things so much. And it's so true. It's what you just said too about like setting short-term goals like are too big and long-term goals too small. That is so absolutely true. And that's such a good insight because I think that a lot of times when we get into running, when we're brand new to running, we make all this progress, right? Like because we're just starting something new. And so like my husband and I, we coach a high school cross country team and we joke like our goal for freshmen is to not break them. Like that is it because they will naturally get better because they've never run before. Most of them, this is the first thing that they're doing. So as long as we don't overtrain them, they're going to improve naturally. And I think that a lot of us get into this, especially those of us that get into running 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, like later in life. And we see a lot of this initial progress. And then we expect, well, that's just the way that running is. Like, this is amazing. Well, if I just was able to drop all of this time from race 1 to race 2, then it's going to be a linear progression from here on in. So I can expect to be a sub 4-hour marathoner by the time, in a year. And you and I obviously know it just doesn't work that way. And so what would you say to someone that is having a hard time being patient or having a hard time accepting this idea? Because, we don't like to hear that, right? Like we don't like to hear that it might take longer than we're anticipating.
So the answer I think is going to be everybody's a little bit different about like their why behind it. Some people, what you said is so true about, when you're new, basically, I remember when I was new and every single time I went for a run, I felt like I was setting my watch as like, oh, you set a new PR. Like, oh, you ran
Yeah.
your new fastest 5K.
Yeah.
I remember between my first and my second half marathon, I ran them about 4 months apart and I ran 10 minutes faster from race 1 to race 2. And in race 2, I made some mistakes and got dehydrated and wasn't fueling at that time. So like I would have run even faster. That
Mhm.
was I forget what it was, but like I will it's unlikely that I will ever run a 10-minute PR in the half marathon ever
Mhm.
again, right? Will I run PRs for sure? Will they be 10 minutes?
Right.
Unlikely, right? But we get kind of accustomed to that, and it's a dopamine hit. It's like
Mhm.
yeah, oh my God, it feels so good. And that becomes what we expect. And I actually went through this classic thing. I ran my very first marathon. It gets, like I said, 6 months after I started running, I ran a 4:05. And then a couple months later, my second half marathon, I ran a 1:46 half marathon. So what did I naturally assume that I could do in the fall? I naturally assumed I could run a Boston qualifying marathon. I naturally assumed that I was seeing such amazing linear progression in all of my times. I could easily drop another 30 minutes off my marathon. Didn't happen. Took me like 2 years, 2.5 years to run a PQ.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah. But so, there's a couple of things here. So one, just because you're not seeing progress from day to day, or you're not seeing progress from week to week, doesn't mean you're not actually making progress. And I use the illustration here of you don't see your toenails grow, but they do. And you look it down one day and think, gee, I need to cut my toenails, right? You don't actually see that process happening, though. It happens so slowly, you literally cannot watch it happen in real time.
Mhm.
And so there's a lot of things that are happening inside your body when you are improving your fitness that are happening on a molecular, a cellular level. And that stuff takes time. You're literally changing your biology, your physiology, your biochemistry in order to make yourself a better, faster runner. And that does not happen overnight. So although you may want it to happen on a specific timeline where it feels like you're making measurable, like guaranteed progress, your
Mhm.
body chemistry doesn't work that way. The other thing too is that this, I think, is one of the most important things you can learn as a runner, period, no matter how old you are or whatever you have or have yet to accomplish, is that running is a lifelong sport and a lifelong pursuit of the joy of running. Although, and this is a really weird concept I think to communicate to somebody new, because the goals get us in it and the goals keep us in it, right? And the goals keep us coming back for more. But the end game of running is not to always be chasing a PR. At some point, you are going to have to love running for running's sake. And if the only thing keeping you in the game is the ultimate pursuit of running X time, or X distance and X pace, I would explore how running fits into your life and the pursuit of that thing. Because the joy of running, although the goals are nice and achieving the goals is nice, the process itself, the process of training, the fulfillment and the life lessons that we learn about ourselves through the process of actually doing the work, that's where the real reward is. And there are people, and here's the thing, there are people who are going to set big goals, work for years or over a decade to achieve them, and not ever quite get there. Are they failures? Oh, heck no. They've gained so much. Would they deem their work failure? Absolutely not. I'm sure they've gained immeasurable knowledge and enjoyment out of the pursuit. So it's really important, I think, that we detach the pure chasing of specific goals from, one, a timeline or an expectation, or two, from that the only purpose of this is to chase a specific pace or distance goal.
I could not agree more. And we actually just did a podcast on that as well, which is awesome. Like it was this, it's a kind of a common theme that we've seen come up with some of our athletes recently as well, of this idea of what if I never PR again? And at some point, we are all going to get to that point, right? Like we are, and that point is different for everybody. The age that you are, the experience level that you have, and at some point, the PRs are going to stop coming, and who knows when that's going to be. And if you get to that point, do you continue on? And if you do continue on, why? Right? And so I love what you said there about really understanding that why and falling in love with the pursuit because of the person that you become in the process of pursuing that goal. Because I think that that's one of the things that we miss so often. because of our social media world that we find ourselves in, where people love posting the picture of them with their medal, or the picture of them with that clock of that time that they finally hit, or the picture of their watch and whatever it might be. There are all of these things that are very tangible types of goals. And so to not have that and to be pursuing something else, or have that deeper purpose, is sometimes lost on us because of the culture that we find ourselves in, I think, And so I try to tell people all the time, and I'm sure you do too. I mean, I can already tell just based on what you just said, it's not the achievement of the goal that matters. It's who you become in the process of trying to achieve that goal. That is the real reward. So that brings me to the question: what is one of the biggest things that running has helped you with in your life? And like, how has running benefited you in other areas of your life?
Oh my God. Like there, how long is this episode?
Yeah, I
Um,
know.
yeah, I said this on another podcast. I think it was like last year, that I feel like running has helped me become the person I always hoped that I was inside.
Mm,
Because especially for me, coming from a background of, being an alcoholic, and I had an eating disorder, like, everybody has their own struggles. But for people who are dealing with, real mental health concerns, there's that voice in the back of your head that kind of just sits there and says, you suck. Right. And then when we're in these behavior patterns, which are incredibly maladaptive, whether they're driven by, an eating disorder, or by substance abuse, or by anxiety or depression, or whatever it is. But it's the thing that's kind of like, it's not helping you, but you can't seem to kind of get out of it. It's that self-reinforcing, self-fulfilling prophecy, where it's like, I suck, I'm trying to get better, can't do it, you suck, right? And
mhm.
so, I also went through this interesting, and then there's kind of the whole movement of like the former gifted kids who all have like depression and anxiety now. But
Yeah.
I will be very upfront in saying, I did very well in school, and I was very talented at a lot of things very early on in life. And, extracurricularly, I swam competitively, I played the violin, I was very talented in school. But there were all things that came very naturally to me. So as soon as I had to try at something, right, this is a problem. This is not a good thing, right? As soon as I had to try at something and I found it just a little bit challenging, I was like, screw it. Whatever.
Mm.
And what running has taught me is all the lessons that I feel like I probably should have learned as a child, that I didn't learn until I was in my 30s, about delayed gratification, and patience, and consistency, and self-compassion, and self-kindness. But the belief in yourself at the end of the day, that core belief that you are capable and you can do this. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but if you keep working at it, you will get there eventually.
I think you're like describing me. Like, you and I have so many similarities. It's like the craziest thing. Like, every time I talk to you, I'm like, holy moly. Like, it's so funny because, like, when people ask me that question, they're like, what do you love about running? I'm like, running keeps me humble, because I have to work at it. And like, I, like you, same thing, like, was very successful without much effort growing up. And same thing, like, if I had to work at something, I was like, "Oh, that thing's not for me, clearly." Like, that's why I never played soccer, because I wasn't immediately good at it, even though I have much more of a soccer build than a basketball player build, but, I digress. So, but it is one of those things that I've had to work at, and I was not immediately good at, and I had those same thoughts in my mind of, I'm not a good runner, because running was always punishment in all the other sports that I played. And so I had to get it under this time. And it always felt hard and awful and terrible. And I just, like, automatically just assumed that that meant I wasn't a good runner. And I've had to break that down, that belief system, in order to allow myself to train to become a better one, right? And to show myself what I am actually capable of if I put the effort in, if I put in that consistency and that hard work. So I really love that. And also just the resilience, because I think that when you say about the voices in the back of your head, it is sometimes when I talk to people, they don't realize that we all have that voice. Like, I remember talking, like, one of our clients, and she joined our program. She was in her 60s. And inside of our program, we have like a whole module on mindset and our thoughts and our beliefs and everything like that. And she went through the one lesson, and she made a comment that was like, I thought my negative thoughts were I thought that was a problem that I had. I didn't realize that other people had negative thoughts about themselves too. And that just felt so good knowing that she now understands that that's a normal thing, that she's not some abnormal person that has these negative thoughts about herself. We all have those negative thoughts, and it's what we choose to do with them. Do we choose to take our running journey and those workouts that feel terrible or that run that we had to bail on and use that as evidence of I suck, or try to turn those things around and say, okay, one run does not define my journey. One run does not define me as a runner. Even a whole slew of runs, this training cycle, right? Like we can have times in our life where there's a lot of other things going on, and stress, right? Emotional stress, psychological stress, physical stress, it's all stress. We might have a whole training cycle or a whole year that's no good, that we're not seeing that progress. So I do love that analogy that you used too with the toenails, because that's so true. And as a mom, I see that with my kids, like because I don't see them growing on a daily basis. But then there will be times that they'll do something and I'll watch them and I'm like, it'll just like hit me. And I'm like, oh my God, how'd they get so big? Like, how do we get to this point? Or like I'm scrolling back through my phone and I saw what they were like 5 years ago. And I'm like, they were so little, like, how are we here? Right. But what I'm hearing you say is that with the consistency that we build in our running journey, that's what is available to us, that we can, as we put in the miles, even if we're not seeing the daily progress, the weekly progress, monthly progress, if we kind of turn around and look back 5 years, we're going to be different people than we were at that point.
Yes, it's so funny you say that because everybody, we recently posted all their, first day of school, last day of school pictures of their kids, and everybody's like, 6 inches taller, and like, but you don't realize it, right?
We
All these
don't.
things happen. But going back to what you said about going through sometimes seasons of running where things don't feel good, this ties back to what I said about that. It's that type of kind of meteoric linear progress is not realistic. Although, and as much as I think a lot of runners say, yeah, no, I know that I'm not expecting to PR every single time that I race. Some of you are, whether you realize it or not, some of you are literally expecting to get faster every single cycle, or at least to kind of stay in the same place. And that's also not realistic. And that might be a very weird thing for some people to understand. They're like, what do you mean? I'm going through periods of my training where like, I'm actually less fit. Yeah. Yeah, you absolutely might, because of what else is going on in your life, right? You're not a professional athlete, probably statistically, you're not a professional athlete, right? It's not your job to be in peak condition year round, because life is going to happen to us. We are going to get sick. We are going to have personal losses. We're going to have big moves. We're going to have things that change in our life. And your training, although it should, hopefully be an important part of your life, it's not the only thing that happens in your life. And I recently went through this I feel like I've experienced like hundreds of years of running experience in like only 6 years. But I basically been spending the last 18 months or so coming back from REDS, relative energy deficiency in sport, that was caused by chronic chronic
Yeah.
carbohydrate restriction, because I was totally on that hype train if you don't need carbs to run, and dug myself into a very, very nasty hole. It has taken me 18 months working with a dietitian, being super consistent with my training, working with my coach. Yes, I have a coach. Coaches have coaches. Coaches need coaches too. To finally be in this place now where I think, oh my God, I'm finally feeling like I am now getting back to where I used to be. But the past 18 months have been very, how should I say this? A big ego hit and a big thing to carry around psychologically, especially because I am now a professional running coach, right?
Yes.
To be like, although I have PRs and times, right? And say like, I did do this thing, except now I can barely run for a couple miles without, needing to stop for at least, a couple walk, nothing wrong with run walk. Right. But from the times that I was running before to now be like, I can barely run at all, and to work my way back from there, that's been an incredibly humbling process that, again, has taken longer than I wanted it to, and longer than I think it should have taken. But shoulds are irrelevant. It took as long as it was going to take, and I was very consistent in putting in the work to get myself back to where I wanted to go. So I say this to illustrate that if you dig yourself into a hole or you hit a rough patch for whatever reason and you think like, oh, I should just be like bounce back to where I was, you might not, but there's nothing wrong with that. I think one of the things that's most important, like you said about that, being curious, staying curious. If something's not going right, or something's not going the way you think that it should be going, why? What's missing? What could you do better? Maybe you're just missing consistency and patience. Maybe you're actually missing something, right? So I think it's about, how it running is a true reflection. It forces us inward. It forces us to understand what's actually happening in my body. What's actually happening in my life? How am I actually sleeping? Am I really eating enough? Am I really staying hydrated? Do I really know what things are supposed to feel like? So all of this to say that, like I said, going back to the simplicity versus the complexity of the sport, although running can be as simple as just go out and run, right? Have a good time and go for a run and get some miles in and enjoy the sun on your face and the breeze in your hair.
Yeah.
A lot of this is actually can be relatively complex if you're looking for that true longevity and improvement in the sport.
I agree so much. But how can we be patient during that process and allow, like, obviously when you're focusing on your why, when you're focusing on the journey, like, I think that's definitely a way that we can kind of help ourselves through that. But I love that you shared that, and thank you for sharing that with us, because I think that our ego is something that gets in the way a lot, right? And so how do you manage when your mind is telling you, you suck, you're a running coach, what the heck? You should How can you even find yourself in this position? Like, you should know better by now, right? I'm sure all of these are some of the things that have probably run through your head during this time period. What do you say to yourself?
Yeah, actually, I had a handful of runs last year, and I had two absolutely miserable marathons in the past 8 or so months. But I remember very specifically being on a run and thinking, and it sucked, and it felt like it sucked, and thinking to myself, if this is what it's always going to be like from now on, I don't know that I want to do this anymore. Like I was on a run and thinking,
Mhm.
this sucks so much, and it has sucked so much for what feels like so long. If this is how it's always going to be, I don't want to do this
I'm
anymore. It's
out.
not it's not worth it for
Yeah.
me, right? But it's about, well, what do I enjoy about this? What do I enjoy about this? I like to get outside. I like to move my body. I like to be in this place mentally where I can be, it's almost like a meditative state, right? You just kind of get to ruminate and truly letting go of all of the shoulds. Oh, I should be running this pace, or I shouldn't be taking walk breaks, or I should be running this number of miles per week, or I should be whatever it is, the should. The shoulds are what's, you know, getting kind of not deflecting, distorting what you're trying to do, right?
Mhm.
If you had absolutely zero expectations from your running, and this isn't to say you should go on every single run with zero expectations, right? Like
Mhm.
obviously there are going to be times in your training when you're like, yeah, I'm super like, regimented and like I am very much trying to accomplish specific things, right? But if you're going through a rough patch, and we all go through rough patches at some point, it really helps to let go of all expectations and just focus on, am I enjoying the movement itself? Am I enjoying the time for me? Is this something that I feel like is adding to my life rather than taking away? Is it something that maybe you need to take a break from running as much as you have before and maybe come, if you're going through a period of life where running truly just feels like it just sucks all the time,
Mhm.
maybe take a break from it, right?
Mhm.
Maybe seek help from somebody who can evaluate whether you are experiencing something that's actually contributing to why the running is sucking so much, right?
Yeah.
Physical issue, a mental issue, an energy deficiency issue.
Mhm.
But letting go of the expectations, right? So I'm going to go out there for 30 minutes. I have zero expectations of pace. I will take as many walk breaks as I need. I will wear my sunscreen. I will bring my water, and I will simply enjoy being out there for the sake of being out there.
Mhm.
Now, that is so contrary to how people frame what they expect to happen on a run, that
Mhm.
that almost feels like giving up, which is
Mhm.
interesting, right? That feels like, well, how do I know if I've accomplished the purpose of my run? I'm like, well, the
Right.
purpose of your run is to get out there and enjoy it, right? I'm like, what, but how far should I go? I'm like, as far as you get. How fast should I go? Whatever keeps you at an easy effort pace. So like those types of things, right? Because if you let go of every single expectation for what pace or effort you should be running at, how much distance you should be covering, you say, the goal of this run is to get out there and simply enjoy movement, right? Then you can start to say, what are the things that I really love about this the most?
Mhm. That is such good advice, but I also think it's one of those things that's very hard for a lot of people to do, especially the type A personality that is often drawn to running, because running is a very number oriented sport. It's very easy to quantify our progress. And when it's hard to see our progress, a lot of people often lose faith, and a lot of people start to question whether or not they're really cut out for running, or maybe running's not for me, and they tend to go down that rabbit hole very quickly. I've seen in a lot of people, especially if they're not kind of aware of how much of a role our thinking and the mental side of it has in the way that we perform. So it's a huge mental shift that I see a lot of people needing to take. But I couldn't agree more. I think that it's a big shift that a lot of people need to make at some point, because if running starts to feel like a chore, if running starts to feel like this thing I have to do or I should do, then it's time to just take a step back and ask, like, is this how I really want it to feel? And a lot of people don't even realize that they have that choice. And I love what you said about the shoulds too, because I always tell people, stop shoulding all over yourself, right? Because it's like, there's nothing good that comes from it. Like, we have this idea of like, oh, I should be doing this, I should be doing this. And it's like, it's really just the word could layered in shame is really what should is. Like, it's, oh, well, there's this thing and I know I should be doing it, but I'm not doing it. So there's a layer of like guilt and shame associated with it. And I think that that can very quickly suck a lot of the joy out of our running experience.
Yeah. And especially if you're in a place where you're coming back or rebuilding fitness, or you're not in the place that you want to be. Right. And having gone through this myself, yeah, that should, it's like, well, or I used to be able to do this. Why can't I
Yeah.
now? Or I feel like I should be able to do this. And it's like, well, it's okay. It's okay. Right. It's kind of like giving
Mhm.
it's a multi kind of step process of like, well, you're not, right. You're not where you are, you are where you are. And this place where you're trying to get to, you're not there yet. What are the steps we can take to get you to this place, and
Mhm.
not really put a timeline on it. And the other thing I will say about, the self-talk or these kind of thought patterns is that, one of the things I like to joke about is that, I help type A runners recover from being type A. Nothing freaks a very numbers type A oriented runner more than when I put them on an unstructured pace progression workout.
Mhm.
Because they're like, well, what pace should I hit? I'm like, and I'll say, well, we're going for this long, and every number of, I want you to cycle through,
Mhm.
kind of change through these gears. And
Yeah.
maybe it's a fartlek or maybe it's a continuous progression. Like, but what should I aim for? How far should I go? I'm like, this is self-guided. This is self-led. I want you to explore what these different things feel like. And it kind of blows their mind,
Mhm.
because here's the thing that I have found about most runners who are hyper oriented towards specific metrics. You are using those in place of learning how to trust yourself. You are using numbers in place of learning how to trust what's actually going on inside your body and inside your mind. It's much easier to look at your watch and be like, cool, 7, I'm right on target, versus like, what does it feel like? Am I in the right place? Could I hold this for longer? Could I run faster? Should I slow down? Those are the hard questions. Those are the real skills a runner should be we're learning how to do, not the can I hit X pace? Anybody can learn how to hit X pace. It's very challenging. And this is where I think most runners should try to aim for is, how does it actually feel? And can you learn how to trust yourself in your training without overly relying or being glued to specific numbers, whatever they are?
I totally agree. It's so funny because we have so many electronics nowadays that are supposed to quote unquote help our running or improve our running, but it's one of those things that I think that they often lead to more disconnection with our bodies, right? Because we are depending on this external device to let us know if we're doing it right, to let us know if we're doing a good job. And you're 100% correct that it leads us to not trust ourselves, and it we are not building. It's not that we don't trust ourselves, it's that we're not building that trust with ourselves. We're building the trust in our device, which there's a lot of error in this little device on our wrists as well, right? Like, and I know you talk about that a lot in your content also, which is fantastic. So kind of knowing that you come from this very curiosity based background and you want to understand the science behind running, which is a lot of what your content is about. How do you kind of balance that, right? Because there is a scientific portion to how we get better as runners. And then there's obviously this very intangible portion of learning how to trust ourselves and connect with our bodies and understand effort levels and pacing and all of that. How do you kind of marry the two in your coaching?
Yeah, there's a lot of nuance.
Yeah.
It depends on the athlete. I think everybody has their own relationship with numbers, right? And
Mhm.
measurement and that kind of stuff. I like to say kind of where I start out is that look, the numbers are our guide, not our God, right?
Mm.
Because one, like you said, we know that even the most accurate wearable measurement device is not going to be 100% accurate 100% of the time. It's just not.
Right.
We're talking about GPS, trying to have a heart rate measurement. And yeah, there are going to be some that are more accurate than others, right? A
Mhm.
chest strap is going to be more accurate than the wrist-based optical sensor on your watch for measuring
Mhm.
heart rate. But even your chest strap is not going to be 100% accurate 100% of the time. So what I like to say is that, look, the numbers give us a general framework for where we are aiming. For my super type A runners who really struggle to slow down on their easy runs because they have a lot of feelings about running the paces that are required for them to stay in their easy effort zone,
Mhm.
for them, I do like to flip the script and say, well, guess what? You actually do have a new goal now. Your goal is to stay under X heart rate on your easy runs. We'll take pace, right? If pace is causing you such anxiety that you are incapable of slowing down or feeling okay with slowing down on your easy runs specifically, we're going to remove pace from your watch screen entirely on your easy runs, or you're going to go watch blind and you're just going to go on heart rates. Like we're playing by golf scores, right? The lower, the better. Stay under your aerobic threshold. There are a lot of runners we say we know we're using conversational pace, but it's funny. I'll have runners, do a workout and say like, let's say we're doing 400-meter repeats, and like, let's say we're doing 8 by 400-meter repeats, and do like the fifth one, and then the fifth one is maybe a little bit slower than the rest of them, and then I'll get a little wall of text in final surge about the fifth rep and how they forgot to start their watch and they hit a bat. I'm like, I don't care. I only care about how it felt. Generally speaking, were you in the right pace and effort zone? Yeah, you did the right thing. So it's kind of like, I feel like helping runners understand that although numbers can guide us, assuming we're measuring the right things and we're
Yeah.
in the right general place, even the numbers themselves are not as specific as you think that they are, right? If I'm looking at somebody who ran, again, let's use this 400-meter repeat workout. Let's say they ran, 7 for their, pace, 706, 702, 658, 705. That's pretty even for me, right? It's not like they ran 9 and then 6 and then 8 and then 7.5, right? So I think, again, going back to what I said, my advice for new runners is don't try to do graduate level work when you're in an entry level class, right? That it doesn't, you are probably giving the minutia of those numbers way too much power, way more emphasis than you need to. That blows people's mind.
I agree. And I think that it's funny. And this was like a very interesting realization that I have kind of about the power of numbers and our thoughts around them is that when you hit a workout or a race, but let's just go with the workout again, right? Say you have workouts, because I remember, especially when I was a newer runner, my husband is my coach, and he would give me a workout and he'd be like, these are the paces that you're supposed to hit. I'm like, are you crazy? Like, you want me to do that? Like, I can't do that. And then I did it, and I'm like, well, he thinks I could do it. So I'm going to go ahead and borrow the belief, right? That he has in me, which is another reason that coaches have coaches, right? Because we are humans too, right? Like we might see things and not think that we can be capable of those, but someone else looking in can understand what we're actually likely capable of, right? And so when I did hit those workouts, when I did hit those times, I felt so good about it, which is awesome, which is like one of the things that we love and look forward to. But if we let those numbers make us feel really, really good, then that means those numbers also have the power to make us feel really, really bad. Right. So, like trying to detach our emotion from the number also, I think could be a really helpful thing for a lot of people to start to try to kind of work away from too.
That's a really common thing I see. It's that negativity bias, right? And I think
Mhm.
humans, we're really hardwired to focus on the things that are more negative.
Sure.
Evolutionarily, it makes sense, right? You got to remember the stuff that's bad so
Right.
it doesn't happen again, right? So it keeps you alive.
Mhm.
But how this manifests in our modern world is that we focus on things that are not positive. You were like, oh,
Mhm.
gotta remember the big scary thing. And maybe the big scary thing was that you were 30 seconds off the pace in your last lactate threshold workout. And so you fixate on it, right? It becomes
Right.
this huge thing. It's like, well, maybe you didn't sleep well the night before. Maybe it was really hot out. Maybe you were underfueled, or maybe you were dehydrated, right? Maybe you just didn't have it on the day. That really freaks people out. They're like, what do you mean? I'm like, some days are just bad. I'm like, for kind of a non-specific reason. It's okay. Not everything needs to have a reason.
Right.
But this just, so I love that. You're like, yeah, if the one workout, you do something and you're like, yeah, then that's amazing. Yeah, everything has the flip side. Everything has
Mhm.
every coin is two-sided. It's really interesting. I'm a big advocate in a lot of situations for, even though I prescribe, typically when depending on the athletes I work with in a one-on-one context, sometimes I will put pace ranges, right? In
Mhm.
workouts, not always, but yeah, if I'm like, yeah, but we're doing this workout
Yeah.
and, this is the pace range we're looking for. But there are a lot of situations say, look, I want you to know that this is the pace range that we're aiming for, but I actually don't want you to watch your watch while you're doing this workout. I want you to do it watch blind, or at least not look at what your pace is. Because although this is what we're generally aiming for, I want you to learn what this feels like. And so often, sometimes they end up running faster or better than they realize, because they have to tune out am I doing it right? Am I doing it right? Am I doing it right? Oh my God, my watch says this. My watch says this. My watch says this. And just learn how to shut off their brain and run.
Mm. Yeah. And I think that that's one of the things that will actually appeal to a lot of people is like when we tell them, I'm not trying to put a limit on you. It's that what if we don't even know your limit? What if you're faster than you think you are? What if you've run this time in this race, which would give us these paces, according to our threshold or whatever numbers we're looking at. But what if you're actually way faster than that? And if we give you all of your workouts at this, like with this as our basis, we might not even know. But if you're running by effort and if you get really good at learning how to connect with your body and trust yourself, you could blow through the ceiling that you think is there. Like the potential that you think you have, you might have 10 times that potential, and we might not even know it if we are so strict about these pace ranges.
It's so funny. One of my longtime athletes. She's in her early 40s and she's still like setting 5K PRs left, right, and
Mhm.
center. But she ran a 5K PR last fall, great one. And then like a couple months later, I programmed a workout and it was like 5K pace. And I was like, here's your pace range. And she was like, are you crazy? That I was like, what are you talking about? That's your 5K pace.
Yeah.
Like that is your five. You literally just ran that.
Right.
Like she's like, that's crazy fast. I'm like, you literally just ran that,
Yeah.
So we are so, like I said, going back to that, we're so quick to forget the good and remember the bad, right? Focusing on the, what we think we should be able to do or what we think we can't do. It's
Mhm.
just interesting, right? And then think to yourself, and always comes back to this, is the relationship I have with whatever this thing is it helping me? Really, honestly, is this adding to my life? Is this adding to my understanding of the sport, my enjoyment of it? Is it adding to my knowledge of how to become a better athlete?
Mhm.
Or is it adding to my anxiety? Is it adding to this pressure that I'm putting on myself? Is it making me ruminate or fixate on specific things?
Mhm.
Because those are on the spectrum, right, of a relationship with numbers. And it's totally okay if you use metrics in your training. And I absolutely use metrics in training because I coach virtually, right? I have to
Mhm.
at some point. But it's the relationship you have with those numbers that is really what we're looking at.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think that, a lot of I see two different kinds of athletes a lot of times, and obviously a lot of in between. But there are people that are so fixated on the numbers and they want the exact mileage, they want the pacing, they want this, right? And if you ask them to do those effort-based workouts, it totally freaks them out. And there's also athletes over here that are like, yeah, effort-based training, I'm on board. Totally, like, I love easy pace. And I'm like, okay, let's try a pace-based workout. And they're like, whoa, wait a second, And like you have both camps, which is really funny. And then there's a lot of in between, of course. So I always tell people, what's your goal here? Are you trying to grow as a runner? And they're like, yes. Are you trying to be a better runner? Yes. Growth requires you doing things that feel uncomfortable, right? So if you are someone that loves having paces and it feels very uncomfortable for you to tap into your body and try to figure out what an effort level feels like, that's growth, right? Like even just attempting to do that, the more you practice it, you're going to continue to grow with that. Same thing if you don't like paces, and I'm not the kind of coach that thinks paces are necessary at all. They can be helpful, like you said, like they can serve a purpose, but I think that we know our bodies a lot better than we think we do, than we give ourselves credit for. And they've done a lot of research on the rating of perceived exertion. And the RPE is a tried and true method that is valid and reliable, for us to. So I think that people don't trust themselves and they think that these numbers are better than what they are actually feeling in their body. And I think that if we can get people to a place where they learn how to trust themselves more, they're going to make a lot more progress and be able to get off some of the plateaus that they often find themselves on.
Yeah. And I think that going back to the athlete who's really into specific paces or
Yeah.
specific mileage is that those kind of getting back to the more type A runner about that, they're looking for the guarantee, right?
Yeah.
All my life, when I have done XYZ, I've gotten this specific outcome, right? All I
Mhm.
have to do is put the work in. So you tell me exactly what to do.
Yep.
I will follow it to the letter and then I'm going to get my result. I'm like, well, maybe there are no guarantees. And like you said, in either way, what if you're limiting yourself? What if by being so wedded, so rigid when it comes to trying to run specific paces or specific mileage, you're actually holding yourself back? That never crosses people's minds.
Mm-mm.
I'm like, well, because they're like, but I'm doing all the right things. And I'm like,
Right.
but are you listening to yourself? Right?
Yeah.
Are you actually listening to your body? And that's interesting. I think that's one of the most fascinating aspects about coaching is you can take two athletes who technically on paper
Mhm.
look the same and they are completely different in reality. And that's just the coolest thing to see when you finally are working with an athlete and you have it as a coach. I think every coach has this kind of aha moment after working with an athlete for a little while where you're like, you kind of feel like you unlocked them. You're like, oh, I just learned something about you that like unlocks everything that okay, now I get it. Now I understand you
Yeah.
better. I understand what we're trying to do better. I
Mhm.
understand how to communicate with you more effectively. And I understand, ways to kind of massage or finesse what we're trying to do here. That's the
Right.
coolest part I think about being a coach is being like, here we go. Here's my aha moment.
Yeah. And that's such a special place to be. And I think that's really the science and the art of coaching. Like that's one of the things that my husband always like used to say is like there's a science and there's an art, and you can explain the scientific part, which is why so many people want to hold on to that. Whereas the art is like a lot more, let's kind of see, like we're going to try this out. This is best practice, and then we have to adjust based on what actually happens. And that can be tough for some people, but once they finally welcome that and once they finally embrace that, I think that it just opens up a whole new world in their running journey.
Yeah. And you mentioned plateaus too. And I think that's something that not every plateau needs to be busted, right?
Mm,
Plateaus are kind of a natural. We talked about slumps and rough patches, and can be a natural part of training. Plateaus can also be a natural part of training. I think again, people expect this kind of if I do this, I will always see the results, and it is entirely possible to have a plateau that is a natural part of your progression. Again, the toenails, it might look like nothing's happening, but it's actually happening. You just need to give it a little bit more time.
yeah.
I've seen athletes go through cycles where, they'll do, let's say we do, 3 marathons in 2 years, right? So they run the first marathon with me and we drop a bunch of time. Yay, yay, yay. Awesome PR. Woohoo. Second
Mhm,
marathon, pretty much like, roughly about the same as their
mhm,
previous marathon, right? So still faster than they have been, but not like a huge drop in time, but it kind of feels like nothing's happening, right?
mhm.
Ran the same. A little bit later, keep doing the work, keep doing the work, keep doing the work. Third marathon or third half marathon, whatever the race is, boom, big time drop again. And big
Yeah,
can be subjective. Big can be 2 minutes, big can be 20
right.
minutes, big can be an hour, right? But it's about just, the consistency itself, like you said about those freshman athletes, simply by being consistent and
Mhm.
keeping yourself in the game, keeping yourself consistent with your running over years, that alone will bust through any plateau that you're trying to bust through.
Absolutely. I wish that we could talk for another couple of hours here because I just love having these conversations with you, but it's time for us to wrap up. So, thank you so much for joining us. Where can our listeners find you?
Yeah, at Running Explained. I'm on Instagram and Threads now because that's a new
Ooh.
place that we all hang out. I'm much funnier on Threads than I realized. I feel like Instagram is very much like this is my like serious business Instagram. And, on Threads, I'm like, what gels do you hate?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's a cool thing about Threads though, too, is like I'm seeing that in a lot of different people. Like it's much more casual, which is kind of cool.
It's nice. It's the humanizing aspect of it too.
Mhm.
Instagram, Threads, podcast, the Running Explained podcast. My branding is very consistent. And I also have a website, which is where you can find information about coaching, all my training plans, group coaching, training plus, master classes, all the good stuff. If you want more than just the absolute truckload of free content on Instagram and the podcast, I have more available. It's all in runningexplained.co.
Awesome. And we will put all those links for you guys in the show notes. Thank you so much, Elisabeth, for sharing your story, your journey, all of the knowledge and experience that you have obtained in all of these years and just pouring into our audience. We really appreciate you being here.
Thank you for having me.